I've seen before. So before we dive into our topic, we have usually a quick presentation that I go through. I just will go a land acknowledgement and then talk to you about some events coming up, thank our sponsors, and then we'll dive into the conversation. So I'll just go here. So again, thank you to Fable and Rangle for the event tonight. I'm going to be moving between this, but I'll ask you in a bit to come up and tell us a little bit more about your companies. So quickly, land acknowledgement. QueerTech acknowledges that we are on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe and the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee and the Wendat people, and is now home to many diverse First Nation, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13, signed by the Mississaugas of the Credit, and the Williams Treaty signed with multiple Mississaugas and Chippewa bands. So again, thank you to our annual sponsor for supporting this QT Connect series, RBC, Chrome, Sun Life, Oral Health, Moment Factory, Touch Tunes, Posedia, and World Simple. Again, if you want to keep in touch with the QueerTech events, you can follow QueerTech on any social media. We have all of them pretty much, and it's all QueerTech HQ, so it's easy to find across the platforms. Also, we do send a newsletter twice a month with different events and also different job opportunities. So if you're looking for a job or you are looking to keep up to date with QueerTech, our newsletter is the great way to get that information. And yeah, for those who are looking to donate for QueerTech, you can donate at queertech.org/support, and it goes towards a lot of organizing these events. So I'm going to get Beth quickly to tell you about the upcoming events that's going to be on October 11th.
I'm also very loud, so probably don't need the microphone. But hi, everybody. My name is Beth. I am one of the co-chairs for QueerTech Toronto here. And in October, we'll have another event meetup just like this. This time we will be hosted by BDC, which is the Bank Development of Canada. Our focus for that event will be talking about funding for queer entrepreneurs and queer businesses. So we have a really awesome panel shaping up with some alternative lending sources, folks that will talk about the options that are available, as well as a queer founder who will talk about her experience going through the funding process for her business. So just getting all the final approvals to post that event. So as Nafo mentioned, if you follow the socials or you get our newsletter, you'll see all the information about that event. But that'll be coming next month on October 11th, and that'll be hosted again at the BDC offices just down at 81 Bay Street in the beautiful CIBC building. So if you're interested in learning more about funding for queer businesses, please join us for that one. And thanks for coming out tonight.
Thank you. Awesome. Another announcement. So you might have heard that QueerTech, we're hosting our first national conference. Is going to be QT conference on November 10 and 11. It's going to be here in Toronto. It's going to be a hybrid conference. And so we're very excited. We just opened registrations for participants. So if you are interested to look at the agenda and the speakers and stuff like that, you can go on queertech.org and there is a page for the conference. Great. So before we move to our speakers, I would like to ask Cindy to come and tell us something about Rangle, and then Felipe.
First, hi, my name is Cindy. I'm the head of talent acquisition for Rangle, and my throat is cracking. It's really always happens. Funny. I first want to thank everybody for attending. We're really excited to partner with QueerTech and really appreciated the last couple of years of having these events and being able to attend and participate. A little about Rangle. So we're a digital product consultancy. We're located here in Toronto. We've gone fully remote, and of course, I would be remiss as a head of talent acquisition to not remind everyone we are actively hiring. We are fully remote, and of course, we look for lots of talented people within design and development. But again, thank you so much for attending, and I really appreciate the opportunity for us to have this conversation tonight.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah. Hi everyone, Felipe, Customer Success Manager at Fable. Thank you so much for having us. Super excited to have tech folks here in Toronto. So Fable, we are an accessibility manual testing company. We are based in Toronto, fully remote as well, and we are hiring for roles of sales, people, and product. So definitely connect with me, and definitely let's explore some of these cool opportunities. Thank you so much for having us.
Awesome. Thank you. All right, and thank you again, everyone, for the support and coming. And so I'm going to invite Albert now to tell you more about the speakers and the event. Please welcome Albert.
Okay. All right, so this is what we've been waiting for. Today's topic is building inclusive and accessible products. And today we have two speakers with us that will be in conversation in a fireside chat about this topic. It's a vast landscape, so we're going to try to give you a quick introduction on what this is all about and dive into some anecdotes. So first up, we have Thomas, who's a software architect at Rangle. He's worked in software development for over 15 years, and he's a hands-on software architect and web accessibility specialist that's passionate about creating inclusive experiences and battling reactionary development. Having worked in many different corporate environments, he draws on this wisdom on what he's going to share with us tonight. Online with us is Richard from British Columbia. So he's joining us remotely. He is working in quality assurance focused around web accessibility. He's been involved in accessible technology for over 5 years. As a blind person, he's gained knowledge of accessible tech from a very early age and has been using computers with adaptive equipment for most of his life. One of the achievements he's really proud of is working with the Vancouver Pride Society to include live audio description of the Vancouver Pride Parade. The first year this was done was in 2015. Richard is happily married to his husband for over 6 years now, and they have a new member of their family, as Richard has just received a new guide dog this year. So okay.
Thank you, Albert. Hi, everybody. My name is Thomas. I'm a web accessibility specialist and software architect at Rangle, as was just mentioned. Welcome, everybody. Hi, Richard. Can you still hear me?
Yeah, you're fading in and out a bit, but I'm
hear you.
getting the gist of what you're saying. So
There we go. Perfect. Just want to make sure. I want to start off just by talking a little bit about accessibility and inclusivity and what those kind of mean from my perspective. Everybody has a different kind of perspective and what they think it is. So I want to give you my perspective. And I'm going to start off with accessibility. And most people will be in the thought of accessibility is just catering to people with disabilities, but that's pretty far from the truth. It includes way more people than just people with disabilities. Excuse me. And inclusivity is kind of the umbrella over everything. It includes accessibility. So it's not just one, it's more than one. So some people think, okay, it's just people with disabilities, so what am I catering to? When we talk about accessibility on the web or in product, we usually end up talking about how is somebody going to hear this information, read the information, are they able to read the information? And when we talk about inclusivity, we're kind of broadening that, and we're talking a little bit more on the language that we're using, how people might feel about the content that we're actually showcasing. So there's a little bit more than that. And Richard, I want to grab your thoughts on that as well.
sure. So as Albert mentioned, I'm Richard Marion. I currently reside in Richmond, British Columbia, the traditional unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, Tsawwassen, and Kwantlen First Nations. I think that when you look at inclusivity, like one of the things, especially in the work that I've been doing, we tend to look at raw accessibility issues, and we're moving towards inclusivity. And so inclusivity for me really means is it usable by everyone if possible, when possible. The other thing too, when we're looking at inclusivity, is involving in our case people with disabilities from the start, and in the actual design and implementation of products and services. Because one of the things, as Thomas mentioned, like a lot of times accessible products and accessible websites tends to be reactionary when the developers find out after people try to use their products and services that they can't actually use it, and can't actually use it with various adaptive devices like screen readers or switch devices, or the language that's being used is too complex. And so when you design, think about inclusive design and embrace the principles of inclusive design, then that work starts right from the beginning. And so then it becomes less reactive and more proactive as far as accessibility and usability. Customer, like as we move to more and more online experiences and more services being delivered by technology and online or other services, customer experience is changing, and customer experience really involves more than just is it accessible to people using adaptive equipment. Is it actually usable by everyone, and can people of all abilities and different abilities understand it?
Thanks, Richard. Someone? Okay.
Do you want me to continue?
Yeah, sure, if you'd like, if you have more.
Well, I don't have more on that, but I did, like I was going to say that my background in accessibility has ranged from advocacy now to more of a consulting role, and a lot of times for me personally, it's hard to not be the advocate when you're meeting with developers and customers and talking about accessible products and services. But every once in a while, you still have to do a bit of advocacy outside of your work life. And one of the anecdotes I wanted to share was a couple of years ago, I actually had my husband and I use an online grocery shopping service that's here in BC, and they had actually updated their app, but it became virtually unusable to anyone using a screen reader like myself. So initially, I made what I thought was a reasonable request to their online tech support about the accessibility of the product, and it didn't actually happen. So what ended up resulting is that I, out of frustration for not hearing back from the company, I wrote a letter to one of the consumer affairs programs here about the product. And as a result, my little bit of advocacy and media relations turned into a more accessible product that I was involved with, help assisting them on actually improving it. So that's where my background in advocacy really helped. And then also, as was mentioned in my introduction, the working with the Pride Society here to include more accessible services for people with sight loss or people who are blind, so they can enjoy the spectacle, which is our annual Pride Parade in the summer, was really great. And that was a more collaborative advocacy effort, because it happened at a time that the Pride Society was very interested in becoming more accessible and inclusive for a wider range of people with disabilities.
Thanks, Richard. So I'll talk a little bit about some of the issues that I've run into as being an advocate, and also a consultant for accessibility. Clients in the past that I've worked on tend to leave the accessibility thought as an afterthought. And this makes it really hard to change later. There's a lot more effort that has to go on to be put in place. And this adds cost. And we always want to try to keep those costs low. But if you're not thinking at the forefront, these costs can add up, even the smallest little thing. We don't know how long it's going to take somebody to add a piece of alt text to an image that has been missing because maybe their code is really weird and complex or whatnot. So that adds time. Other times, it's just been taking into account even the language that they're using. So that comes into the inclusive part of this is, for instance, if we have a form and we're asking for gender, we have to ask ourselves, is that appropriate for this particular form? And not only is it appropriate, but if it is appropriate or you do want that information, are we asking for every single possible inclusion of that gender identification? But is it really needed? So there's a lot of things to think about. And again, as an afterthought, might be already too late in some respects. Richard, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, and like I was glad you brought up the point about gender, because we often, even as we in organizations we think are more aware, you'll see they'll ask for gender on forums if they're doing the collection of equity data, and they still will list the more traditional genders first, and then have a catch-all for other, because now there's so many ways that gender is identified, and it's to the point where, as you said, like organizations do have to question whether they collect that data, and if they do they just want to just basically put the word gender with an edit box, and someone can just type what their gender is, period, and as opposed to selecting something that really isn't the right fit, or having to select the other category as well too. So the other thing too is if you're unsure of language when you're developing your sites, that's when you ask people, like there are people with disabilities that, for instance, now prefer to say disabled person and have the disabled come first, and because it's a bigger part of their identity, and similar to using words like visually impaired or blind or whatever. There are people who are blind like myself that do use the word blind quite regularly in dialogue describing ourselves.
It's a really good point that you bring up, because I've run into a similar situation on what people prefer in terms of how they would like to be identified. You just mentioned that disabled should possibly come first. Is that a personal preference, or is that more of a general preference?
I think it's more, it really depends. Like it's for me, I still consider, if I'm talking about my disability generally, I still put the fact that I'm a person first, then the disability is secondary. But they're like, I've got a number of friends and colleagues that are a little more insistent about saying I am a disabled person, or I am a blind person, or whatever. It's a bit more. It's sort of shifting as people become more aware of identity usage, I think, as well too, because I think it's the sort of the greater understanding that the awakening of the world to issues facing people of color, black and indigenous people. I think it sort of made people sort of have further thoughts on how they actually identify their disability as well too.
Maybe let's talk a little bit more about the accessibility side and product, and where we're kind of sitting now, and where these thoughts should really come into play. There's a term that we try to shift everything And that means really trying to start as high up as you can in certain processes or at the very start of certain processes. One might be if you're looking at the UX and design side of things, maybe your process starts there. Should accessibility be starting there? Yes. Should it be starting before that? Yes. Can we get people start to think in the space of, if we have a buy-in to do accessibility sooner, can we cater to the inclusivity of everybody sooner? This includes even sometimes the CEO of a company understanding and having empathy to start this process, start thinking of this process right away. This also helps fundamentally, in my opinion, helping introduce people to these concepts and actually actively developing for them or designing for them. And it helps to get these types of approvals happening faster, which means you're moving faster. I think it's quite important. We're getting there. It's a slow start, I think. But as everything else is progressing, it's really coming kind of into its own. People are recognizing these, and we're trying to start it. Case in point, I came into a client that had no concept of, not that they didn't have a concept of accessibility or inclusivity, they did, but they weren't fundamentally implementing it right away. They were like, oh, well, that might cost too much, or that's going to take too much time, or it's too hard. Of course, it's always hard at the end, but perhaps we can start thinking about this earlier. And even if we do have to do this at the end, can we, what's the easiest strategy? We don't have to do everything all the time, all at once. That's very difficult, but the small moves. And so a little bit will help each and every time you start looking at code or your designs for that matter, or even talking with management, higher management, doesn't really matter. Get them thinking about it, get them talking about it, and that will help move things along. Richard?
Yeah, so like your CEOs don't really, that they don't have to understand the underlying code for everything if you're dealing with the technology or your online presence. But like, yeah, as long as they're committed to it, and even if they, I think it even benefits if they've had some sort of personal buy-in. Like my previous employer that got a new CEO during my employment time, and they were very familiar with what with one of our accessibility initiatives because they had some personal experience with a variant of the similar initiative that they were really committed to at their previous employer as well too. And I don't know if it made it didn't, the project was well underway, so it was hard to tell if it made a major difference, but it was nice to see that when this person spoke at the launch of the new service, that when they actually read their speech, you could tell that they were committed to it and they had some level of education based on their prior experience as well. The other thing too that I want to mention too is because it was mentioned earlier about employment opportunities. A lot of times when we think about inclusivity, we really only think about public facing inclusivity, and we have to actually move more towards looking at inclusivity on the employment side, like what services and products are needed to make our workspaces inclusive to people with disabilities as well too, because a lot of times, unfortunately, and it's getting less, but accessibility does stop at the door to the employee area, and so it's getting better, and it's but especially as we now see with the labor shortage, the more important need to make sure that our workplaces can accommodate people with various disabilities that are skilled workers in the areas that we need to fill labor shortages in.
Thanks, Richard. Don't want to end too soon, but there has been someone waiting very patiently with a question, and I want to recognize you.
So I think one point I kind of been thinking about a lot during this whole presentation was accessibility. So the reason I feel like accessibility isn't talked about much is because one of the reasons is especially, well, I guess I'm personally biased because I've been working on a small team at a, well, I'm not at some mega corp. Sometimes I work at like solo projects, but especially in that kind of context, accessibility gets very intimidating because I know at the megacorps they have an entire team of people who are just literally in charge of that accessibility, but it kind of adds another layer of complexity that needs to be dealt with. Sorry, as part of a small team, which can, and I was just wondering what would you say is the best way to address that specific case?
Okay, let me summarize for the people online in case they didn't hear you. So looking at even small shops, perhaps, the breadth and scope can be overwhelming for implementing accessibility. So where's a good place to start with that? Is that a good summary?
Yes.
Okay.
Especially, where's a good place to start with that? How to get it done? Because I've heard that it's not just good to have in some places, but it's like the law in some places.
Yes, so not just where to start, but also what to start with and what is actually necessary and by law.
Or should we even launch without it in and go delay this another year?
So I can't speak to the law of it. I am not a lawyer, so I can't give you any advice on that and on the specifics. However, when we're looking at implementing accessibility, there is a standard that we can go by, the Web Accessibility Standards Guidelines, WCAG. And there's a lot of information there. So that's even that reading through it can be very overwhelming, but it can be a good starting point. Some of the laws will dictate, depending on the size of your company, that you will have to declare what you are doing to further your accessibility to the public. And there's different requirements for different sectors. A good place to start is the smallest little piece that will benefit the larger audience. Sometimes this will take possibly user testing and going out and getting the opinions from other people, from actual users who may be using your product, app, or site. It can be as small as starting sometimes with just making sure you have alternate text for your images. It could be simply making sure that you have your forms labeled appropriately. So people who do not see very well, have low vision, possibly blind, can understand the context from which they're trying to access your site. Richard, do you have any opinions on this? I'm sure you do.
Yeah, yeah, I did. Yeah, I do. But you've covered a lot of it. So I think the other thing, like especially if you're a small organization, like if you can still have a simple interface on your website and that looks good, and that goes a long way to sort of help people as well too. So if you don't have the budget to audio describe all your online videos, for instance, it might be better not to even have them. But if you do have them, you can post a text transcript of it instead. And there are some things you can do to work around it that actually still will put you in compliance with the Web Accessibility Content Guidelines, which are just guidelines. They're not the law. And as Thomas said, like there are, depending on the size of your business, there are definitely laws that would apply. If you're in Ontario, the AOTA probably applies if you're above a certain size business, and other provinces are in the process of implementing provincial legislation. If you're a company that actually is in a nationally regulated industry, you may have to look at whether you have to comply with any accessibility plan or customer service standard for the Accessible Canada Act, but that's not quite as far along as the Ontario legislation. It's on paper, the Ontario legislation is the furthest along. In practice, it's lagging quite far behind what the government's commitments have been. But that's my political comment for the afternoon or evening.
That's all good. Thank you, Richard. how we're doing for time, but I'm happy to take more questions if anybody has a question.
Yeah, I'm always wondering, like, if we have to look a little bit on the state of accessibility product, you know, someone like Richard using the internet apps, what would you say are like, when you're using them, is there a percentage you would say that we're at in Canada in terms of usability of these products? Do you find 20% of the product you use are accessible, 30%, 15%? Like, is there a percentage kind of understanding as a whole? Because I feel there's so many apps and so many websites out there, and like, I wonder how often people are really thinking about accessibility and implementing.
Did you hear any of that, Richard?
I did. Let me try to and I'd see if I got it. So I'll just try to summarize your question, and then if you can just say yes or no. So I guess you're wanting to know what percentage of web pages or online applications are accessible, whether it's in the 20% range, and whether another 30% or more are maybe usable but not really accessible, and the rest aren't accessible. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, I would say that overall, I would say the percentage of websites that are fully accessible and are great is probably less than 20%. There's an organization that's called WebAIM that produces an annual survey of websites that they sort of evaluate and check, and the number is going up, but it's still going up slowly, because what ends up happening is, as every year the internet, more and more online content exists, and unfortunately more of it is still not accessible compared to what is being published as accessible. That's why companies like Fable and other companies in the industry that do testing are so and consulting work and assisting with developers and making their sites accessible right from the ground up is so important right now, because the pandemic has definitely shown us that we had to pivot to operating online, and people are comfortable doing it, especially people with disabilities as well too, because it's even for working, working at home has proven to be a benefit to a lot of people as well. But yeah, it's definitely a work in progress, and there is a definite high cost to rebuilding existing infrastructure online, virtually online, and physically in the built environment as well too. So it's thinking about it right from the beginning will I think in the end will reduce the cost and make a much more usable experience for people, and hopefully increase the number to the point where it's way more than 50% of the websites and technical products are fully accessible.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think the more exposure that we have about accessibility and inclusivity, the more it's going to progress. It is slow, but I think we got to keep chatting about it, keep informing people about it, and that's how we'll change the world, hopefully, and get them to see it in a different light, in a different viewpoint, which would be great. Any other questions? Yes.
Okay. I haven't been working in web dev that long personally, but I've had let's say a recent client. Since everybody started, remote working because of the pandemic, I've been put into a team where we kind of manage the customer or the general public-facing one, and another one for strictly employees, and the internal one. I just noticed there's I know you briefly touched a little bit on I would say the amount of accessibility that is in the public-facing one versus something that's strictly internal intranet uses. I don't know if the web survey even takes those internal company intranets into account in terms of web accessibility, because when I just take a look around, if there's a complete stark difference between the two. But I always had this this suspicion. I don't know if it's just me or that if employees who might have a is there any specific advice you could give in regards to like showing them the benefit of having like a more accessible content, not just specifically, not just specifically for the public sphere, but also equally having that within their company to make work tools more accessible, because I am seeing quite a difference between the two, and I'm not going to suspect if we have people who are have special needs, but if we do have them, I'm sure we have some of them, but what do you think some advocacy requirements, or sorry, some advocacy regarding that? That's what I want to.
Okay, so looking for, let me try summarizing. Looking for advice or advocacy on internal versus external sites and or tools to use, because there is not really a significant portion looking at the internal side of things, and you're looking to push it a little bit more to get it more visible. Is that correct?
And not just making your company look good on the outside, but treating
Right.
kind of mediocre on the inside kind of thing.
Okay, so yes, it's not just yes, this comes from a moral standpoint. Are we doing the right thing? Yes, I think talking about it is always helpful. From my perspective, and maybe this is my opinion, and we'll ask Richard to his, I think, if you want to get exposure there, it's really about empathy training at this point, to get them to see benefits of doing it. So I'm just going to pose a question. You don't have to answer it, but how do you know that anybody within your company or even external has a disability? You might not know that. So not knowing that, should you still cater to that? Yes.
How do you convince the stakeholders?
How do you convince the stakeholders to do that? That's a really good question. I'm gonna ask Richard first. Do you have an opinion on that? How can you convince the stakeholders that doing the right thing and making internal tools and or intranets accessible as well as your external?
Good question. I guess it was.
It's a loaded question, I think.
It's a loaded question, and because especially if it's an organization that spends public dollars as well too. Like the argument is, well, we need to actually be responsible with the public's money, and so we're going to spend it on public facing activities, and then and then not deal with the internal stuff. So I think the way you would convince stakeholders is, I think a couple ways. Like again, this is where CEO buy-in is really important as well too, and even sort of how trying to get them to, especially if they have a personal commitment to it, to actually influencing the vice presidents and then directors and managers that might actually implement this. The other thing too, if you're a small organization or a medium-sized organization, you could have this discussion about this is big a part of the other equity, diversity, inclusion discussions that a lot of companies are having, as the part dealing with gender equality and racial equality as well too. So it's kind of reaching that level of importance, because it's there are a lot of barriers that still happen, even to the point where you might be able to hire a person with disability. They can maneuver around the office, but then they can't use the coffee machine in the kitchen because the counter in the kitchen is too high, or they can't, in my case, even submit their own payroll timesheets because the payroll software interface wasn't accessible. Those are the kinds of things that, unfortunately, especially large organizations that are using legacy software, only find out after they've hired someone with a disability. The other thing that they might be able to do is, when they're sourcing new products, is include an accessibility requirement from their third-party vendors as well too, and and then that assists them and actually pushing the industry itself to be more accessible as well too. If more businesses included an accessibility requirement in their call their request for third-party products, especially for ones that have to be customized for internal use, it would push the industry forward to include to again build accessibility into internally based products that are used on intranets as opposed to just the publicly facing ones.
Does that help answer your question a little bit?
It does give a lot of insight, yes. I mean, it's still difficult to know if an employee or somebody requires that extra assistance, but it's more of like convincing the stakeholders of the long-term benefits, I suppose.
Yes.
Yeah.
I do agree too that not everybody is always forthcoming in terms of the assistance that they need. I'm not going to speak to it because I'm also not in HR, but I think that is also part of the culture at the particular company that you're at and how inclusive and diverse they are. But I can't speak to that.
Yeah, and HR's got HR has to has to be a key player in those discussions, and not just in large organizations that have an HR director or vice president. It's all the recruiters in HR as well too, because often companies will put we are an equity employer and we encourage people with disabilities, and they'll list other groups and equity groups that can apply. But then when you request the accommodation, if the recruiter that you have isn't really personally committed to it, might actually tell you, oh, we can't do that. And so there's unfortunately in HR, there's got to be buy-in right from the top to the very bottom.
Any other questions? Anything online? Yes, at the back.
This one's for Richard. Richard, you mentioned that the Ontario accessibility legislation was actually further along than the federal legislation. What do you think the federal legislation has missing?
Well, the federal legislation, I didn't hear the very end of your question, but the federal legislation was only passed by Parliament in 2019, priar to the election that year, and then the regulations and implementation has only started in 2021 since the last federal election as well. So it because of there was a pandemic pause like a lot of stuff as well. So the reason why the Ontario one's further along, it's older legislation. It was first passed, I believe, in 2005, I want to say 2000 or 2005, I can't remember now. It mandated that fully accessible Ontario by 2025. Like I said, on paper it's much further ahead, but in practice I think there's been a lack of commitment from the government to actually follow through with the various commitments in the act as well too. So it's on paper, like I said, it's great legislation, but it hasn't been, whereas the federal one is newer. It's newer, and it might end up being better legislation, but their commitment is a fully accessible Canada, which basically means federally regulated industries by 2040.
Okay, awesome, brilliant. How are we for time? Yes, we got another question. Yeah, sure.
Hello. Okay, cool. Okay, my question is for both of you. Richard, you work with a lot of teams and large enterprises in creating inclusive products, and you as well, Thomas. Wondering from your experience with those big companies, I assume that budget is not a concern. Maybe it's already embedded into their project. They have leadership buy-in. I'm wondering from when you're actually doing the work and they are, working on accessibility already, what are the biggest barriers from actually practicing inclusive design? Have you noticed any patterns on? Have you seen the same issues come up every project, or like every other sprint, there is the same issue coming up. What is the biggest barrier in actually practicing inclusive design?
I'll take that one first, Richard. One of the biggest barriers that I have run into, and the size of clients or the work doesn't matter. It's usually the same, and it's just not thinking about it's just not thinking inclusively. So everything is kind of a miss. And when we're talking about the inclusive design, it's not just about the colors, it's also about language and whatnot. But sometimes there's the bias that goes into that design, and then that is translated down to the developer, because we kind of rely sometimes on the design to feed us that information. There's also a language and communication barrier that can happen too between design and development. But once it's missed in one place, it usually just kind of rolls down, and then you catch it later, or oh, do that later. That's fine. That's one of the barriers. And a lot of times for me, it's looking at like labeling is one of the biggest ones, and referencing on labeling. Like if you have a text field, it's not labeled in a way. It might be shown, but it's not referenced, and that way I just don't know what that text field is. That's from a screen reader standpoint most often. So, or it's mislabeled, or there's redundant information. But these things are not always given at that design level, and that allows me to try to infer what is meant by the user experience, right? So what does your button say? Is it set appropriately? Do you have a link? What does that say? Does every single link on your website say read more? That doesn't give somebody enough context, right? We won't run into there, I think. Does that give enough context? And it might visibly be shown. That's fine. You know, as a visual person, I am able to discern different patterns. Someone who is blind has a different way of perception, and this is most often than not helped and aided by a screen reader, which dictates what is on screen. Richard, what your thoughts on that?
I think you covered most of it. Like the one thing is screen readers, like since we're now talking more specifically about screen readers, like they intercept the raw stream of data that's being sent to your computer's display. And so if that raw stream of data doesn't have the accessibility hooks, but then often your link may say something like start here, but the raw stream of data is going to spew out a bunch of HTML code, and so if that's the kinds of things that, especially on first pass throughs of websites, like I mainly do user testing. And so a lot of times it depends on where the customer's at in their accessibility journey. Like a lot of times they're just getting started with Fable, and they just want parts of their website to go through a first pass through our user community. And so a lot of times you'll see things that are totally not working, and to the point where you basically have to stop doing the user test because you can't complete the task that the customer wants, and then it's up to the people at Fable that work with their directly with their developers on how to code things to fix it, and as well too. So it's it really depends. But yeah, I'd say I run into the same problems, I think, generally with every website that's been tested, unless it's a website that's basically near complete and they just want a final review of it. And those are great. Those are the ones I love, when you basically take 15 minutes to do some tasks on a website, and it's all a pass. That's a rewarding experience, especially when you've been involved in user testing the beginning of it as well too. It's nice. The other thing too is links that don't work. My pet peeve is the skip to content links that never work. And I think that's kind of, I always think, oh, it's great, it's there, but it didn't work. And especially it's kind of yeah. So like and of course those are the kinds of things that a lot of times like if your developer said, well, I tested it with NVDA and Chrome, but it didn't work with JAWS and Edge. And so unfortunately, it's sometimes when things work, it's browser specific even.
Very true. Thank you, Richard. I'm going to hand this back now to Albert. Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the chat.
Thank you for joining us this evening. Thanks again for everyone for joining. We have pizza still, we have drinks, so please stick around, meet each other. Part of this is really building our community here as well, so thanks.
Well, enjoy your pizza. Thank you very much for letting me participate remotely from here. Part of me would have rather have been in Toronto, but
Next time, Richard.
Yeah, you too.
Thank you.
you're welcome.